Buddhist science is a study on Buddhism based on facts and science.
The Buddhism Description by Western Intellectuals, by Venerable Rung Ruang Papart Saro, Dr. Rungruang Limchu Patipa. The Western exposure to the Buddhism in the 19th century was mostly through the Buddhist documents and scripts in the Theravada Suttas, which are considered as the original suttas of the early Buddhism. And the Buddhism received many interests from the Western intellectuals as follows. Buddhism Description by Thomas Huxley. In the 19th century, when the Buddhism was firstly introduced to the West, a famous biologist, Thomas Huxley, commented on the Buddhism from a scientist view as follows.
A system which knows no God in the Western sense, which denies a soul to man, which counts the belief in immortality a blunder and the hope of it a sin, which refuses any efficacy to prayer and sacrifice, which bids men look to nothing but their own efforts for salvation, which, in its original purity.
This comment is probably one of the most accurate description of the Buddhist science. Huxley's vision on Buddhism as an ancient science is very precise. Buddhism Description by William James. William James, who was a founder of modern psychology, explained that the discrete mental phenomenon of a state of mind could be observed during the feeling of consciousness, and therefore the being alive was simply a sequence of stream of consciousness. He adopted the Buddhist concept about the mind and suggested a threefold strategy to study the mind as follows.
Mental phenomena should be studied indirectly through the careful observation on behavior and of the brain and should be examined directly by means of introspection. Among these three approached, the introspective observation was what we had to rely on first and foremost and always.
At that time there was no invention of the fMRI, functional magneto-resonance imaging, yet, and no scientific equipment to perform any research studies on the mind. Therefore the study of mind through the central nervous system was not available and there was no scientific study on the consciousness and the mindfulness. As a result, the study of mind had to be limited on the mental observation in behavior science only. However, his foresight on the importance of Buddhism was very encouraging to modern science, as he mentioned that
this, the Buddhism, is the psychology everyone will be studying from now.
Buddhism Description by Niels Bohr. The similarity of the observation principle between Buddhism and scientific studies in searching for the truths of nature was first recognized by Niels Bohr, a Nobel Prize winner, as he mentioned as follows.
For a parallel to the lesson of atomic theory, we must turn to those kinds of epistemological problems with which already thinkers like the Buddha and Lao Tzu have been confronted, when trying to harmonize our position as spectators and actors in the great drama of existence.
The Buddha used the mindfulness to observe the mental phenomena, while typically science uses scientific equipment to observe the nature. However, since the mind processing is a very delicate phenomenon and there is no scientific equipment to observe the mind yet until the innovation of fMRI recently. In Buddhism, the knowledge is gained from performing an introspective observation on mental phenomena as described in A Practice of a Spectator Observing on Actors of Insight Being in the World. Buddhism Description by Bertrand Russell. The Nobel Prize mathematician Bertrand Russell admired the science in Buddhism as follows.
Buddhism is a combination of both speculative and scientific philosophy. It advocates the scientific method and pursues that to a finality that may call rationalistic. In it are to be found answers to such questions of interest as what are mind and matter. Of them, which of greater importance? Is the universe moving towards a goal? What is man's position? Is there living that is noble? It takes up where science cannot lead because of the limitations of the latter's instruments. Its conquests are those of the mind.
In Buddhism, the study of the mind leads to the knowledge of life, mind, and matter, as described in the process of dependent origination explaining the relations of life within nature. The present research in Human Connectome project reveals how the mind functions by certain cause and effect within the central nervous system, not by any self. Buddhism description by Alfred Whitehead. In the 20th century, as the science is growing strongly in the physical world, leading to a human need to balance the spiritual side together in along with the science development, in this sense the Buddhism is a religion that promises to be a good potential one to bridge this gap, as Alfred Whitehead, a Nobel Prize winner, mentioned as follows.
The future course of history would center on this generation's resolving the issue of the proper relationship between science and religion. So fundamental are the religious symbols through which people give meaning to their lives, and so powerful the scientific knowledge through which we shape and control our lives. And it is regarding this troubling issue, I think, that Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism, are seen to hold out the promise of achieving some resolution. Buddhism is the most colossal example in the history of applied metaphysics.
The Buddhist science in searching for the truths of life within nature by the advance in modern science and technology will harmonize the knowledge between the material and spiritual world together. It promises hope to resolve the present crisis of all man-made disasters. Buddhism description by Dennis Noble. The Buddhist notion of no self is recognized by scientist Dennis Noble in his statement as follows.
Buddhism is to say that it is itself a form of science, open to test in the form of personal experience in examining oneself and one's relationship to the world. It is a key aspect of that experience to find that there is no such thing as the self, an idea of no self.
The Buddhist science is intended to serve this view, and the law of science proves that there is no self. Buddhism description by Arnold Toynbee.
There is a kind of intellectual provincialism in the dogma that life is just one thing after another. Human affairs do not become intelligible until they are seen as a whole. Of all the historical changes in the West, the most important, and the one whose effects have been least understood, is the meeting of Buddhism in the Occident. And when and if our era is considered in light of larger societal patterns and movements, there can be no doubt that the meeting of East and West, the mingling of the most ancient traditions in the modern world, will form a much larger part of history than we today, with our political-economic emphases, may think. The coming of Buddhism to the West may well prove to be the most important event of the 20th century.
As present, the world is driven by extremists on the material side, lacking any spiritual development. We are now in a crisis of all man-made disasters. The Buddhist science promises to bring peace back to mankind, and this is the most important event of the 20 centuries. Buddhism description by Francisco Varela.
Buddhism is a practice, not a belief, and every Buddhist is, in some way, lay clergy, involved in the way a scientist is involved in his or her work, or in the way a writer's mind is involved in writing, present in the background, at all times. People today have the leisure and sophistication to practice what before was only practical for monks. Buddhism affects Western culture through the individuals who practice it, through people who occasionally take it up as an escape. Buddhist ideas are prevalent throughout our culture. In physics and biology, for example, the basic ideas are Buddhism in disguise. My view of the mind has been influenced by my interest in Buddhist thought. Buddhists are specialists in understanding this notion of a virtual self, or a selfless self, from the inside, as lived experience.
Conclusion. The journey of Buddhism to the Western world is a series of stepping milestones, beginning with the rediscovery of the Buddhism in India by Sir Alexander Cunningham in the 19th century, and when the Buddhist teachings were translated to Western languages by the Pali Text Society. This translation work is very important, because then many Western intellectuals can read and beginning to know and understand what about the Buddhism is, and the advanced concept of searching for the truths of life within nature with the practice of introspective observation, not believing, is so attractive to the Western scholars. The Buddhism is a unique religion that completely sets aside from all other religions of which followers believe in different gods. It is not until the 20th century that the world begins to transform into a scientific world, when people beginning to question and challenge the existences of personal God and many other supernatural powers in nature.